Yes, Richard. Yeah, I do. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I'm only going to be here until like 5 minutes. Mentally, yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. We're not.
Well, now we're here.
Okay.
That's what
Yeah. It was forbidden.
are you until how long?
London. Yeah. Which ended up being very there's too much space
Funny
there.
how they do that.
For lockdown.
Yeah.
No, don't worry about it. I just, as long as you don't like Sparty Sorry, yeah, I just
You think you're racing, but actually,
yeah, it's just like a mall, basically. Yeah. Yeah, directly south of the. I don't know if there's anything yeah.
I want to know if you're intentional.
Yeah, I don't think we just make some doing the exact same thing. Yeah, I mean, my view on this is that I think more voices better.
She said she would appreciate
Yeah, just the utter disparity.
Well, David, are we ready? Good morning, Steve. Good. Yeah, we're. Good morning, everyone. Let's get started. John always say the best way to be on time is to start on time. So here it is, 9 o'clock, and I'm already working into Andrew's time because I'm getting mine for sure. So anyway, thank you very much. We had I think most of you are there, and hopefully the people online were watching our thing last night. It was, I think it was quite interesting particularly, I was impressed by Joseph Bourgault's reference to his faith in God. And I was telling some people after the meeting when in I guess some of our friends are probably still having breakfast, but in 1972, I spent 3 months in France, like supposedly learning how to speak French. And at the end of it, I got an award for the worst pronunciation. But at least I got an award. But in any event, at one point we had to go out we had to spend a weekend out like 100 miles from where we were going to school. And the professor said, well, don't take any money, because if you do, all you'll do is get a room and drink beer and you won't learn anything. So he told us not to take any money, which was sort of convenient because we didn't have any to take, even if he told us not to. But anyway, we hitchhiked out to this little Valençay, and so we spent the day wandering around. When we were leaving, there was myself and a fellow from Montreal. And when we were leaving, the professor said, if you get in trouble, like, go to the church. And I thought, well, that was pretty good advice then. It's probably pretty good advice today. So by the end of the day, we weren't really in trouble, but we hadn't seen anybody who had any inclination to help us with food or a drink or anything. So we went to the Catholic church, knocked on the door, and in my best French, I said, is your husband home? And in her very eloquent French, she said, êtes-vous Catholic? And I said, no. And so she pointed me to the youth hostel where I had a really good time. It was quite amazing. So anyway, I was impressed with Joseph Bourgault, and I guess like my message for this morning is, if you get in trouble, go to the church. And so having said that, I'm not the person who's given the inspiration this morning. It's Andrew Lawton, and he's become one of our he's become a dear friend besides a whole lot of other things. But I think besides being a very good reporter with True North and doing a tremendous job of getting out the message, I actually think he's one of our country's new up and coming. I think Ayn Rand wrote a book about folks like you, Andrew. It was called The New Intellectuals. And so I think please welcome one of Canada's new intellectuals. So welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, as always, Danny, not just for the introduction, but for the classification as Canada's new intellectual. I don't know whether to be humbled or terrified for the country, but hopefully by the end of this 35 minutes, you'll be able to decide for yourselves. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to be in Alberta specifically. When I started coming to these conferences back in 2019, Alberta was the beacon of light in a country that needed freedom. It's a bit of a flicker at some points. It hasn't been as idealized as it once was, but I still always enjoy being here. And all of you remind me of why I love Alberta so much. So thank you very much for your hospitality. The talk that I'm going to be giving today is about covering the convoy. But I want to keep with the theme of the conference, which is about climate and COVID, and tell a brief story about climate, and specifically the discussion about climate change, the never-ending discussion, which ties into free speech, and it ties into media bias, and it ties into this idea of two people being able to look at something and draw drastically different conclusions, which is very much connected to the convoy. I was a few years ago, Juneau, Alaska, and as one is, and I was getting a coffee from a coffee shop there, and there was a bulletin board, which is always fun in a community, just to see what's going on, and they had, 8.5 by 11 sheets advertising any number of things. And about half of them were about climate change. There was one that was promoting an upcoming talk on how to deal with the emotional distress of climate change. There was another that was what you can do about climate change. There was another that was an academic lecture about the polar bears dying and all of that. And there were about 4 or 5 more that I can't remember. And then the last one I loved, which was what to do about the fact that nobody talks about climate change. And I was like, well, maybe you should go to the other 7 sessions before you get to the why nobody's talking about it. But again, there is a subset of the population that believes you should talk about it always, every day, in every forum, and still that's not enough because they only want discussions on their terms. And one of the things that's interesting, we hear a lot about media in decline in this country, mainstream media outlets that are hemorrhaging staff and resources. Yet there's also been the creation of a new bureau in a lot of newsrooms. If you look at outlets like the National Observer, which is a very left-leaning outlet, the Winnipeg Free Press, they have climate reporters. people that are specifically on the climate beat. And if you look at the Toronto Star, they have a racism and equity and diversity reporter. And in a lot of cases, if you pay someone $70,000, $80,000 a year to find something, they're going to find it no matter what, because if they stop finding it, they no longer have a job. And this is a big problem with the media, is that they have either an implicit or an explicit agenda that becomes the lens through which they approach everything. And it's the same whether it's climate, it's the same whether it's COVID. How often have we seen political press conferences with premiers and health ministers and Dina Hinshaw where the questions are predicated on the premise that we need to do more in the way of lockdowns? We need to have more restrictions. That's the premise. And because of that, it doesn't matter what the answer is. It's not going to be good enough unless someone says, well, actually, we are coming across and doing this. I had a panel discussion on my show a little while ago about independent media. And I pointed out, and Derek Fildebrandt from the Western Standard was on, and we were talking about how most conservative politicians are more resistant to engaging with conservative media at press conferences than you might assume. And one of the reasons is because all of these conservative politicians, when they're doing a press conference, have to defend against these attacks from left-wing reporters. Someone will say, why are you cutting funding to this program? And then they'll say, well, actually, I'm not cutting funding. We're increasing funding. We're doing more. We're spending more. And then the worst thing is when me comes along, or when a Western Standard reporter comes along and says, yeah, why aren't you cutting funding to that program? And then they have to be like, well, actually, we are. So that's the problem, is that you can't win a war on two fronts. And there's a big narrative problem that we have in Canada and that we have in the media. And I don't want to duplicate the talk that I did yesterday. Normally, when I come here, I try to take on big picture issues. Today, I want to go into the trenches, because sometimes that is where you get, believe it or not, the clearest view. And I can think of no greater example of that than the Convoy in Ottawa. We all know the images, the iconic images that will stay forever of the bouncy castle, the 3 French Canadians in a hot tub, the pig roast, the saunas, the dance parties. We all see that. If you were there in person, you might have seen it in person. If you weren't, you saw it on social media, on independent media. Maybe your friend sent you photos. You contrast that with the image that took place a few weeks later of police horses trampling an elderly Indigenous woman to the ground, of an Eastern European person who fled communism being thrown to the ground and bloodied up by police, a grandpa being thrown to the ground and arrested by police, people, including me, being pepper sprayed. And you say, how did it get there? Well, it started with a honk. It started with a lot of honks, actually. The Freedom Convoy remains one of the most fascinating stories. I would say the most fascinating story I've ever covered in this country, not only because of what it meant to the country. It was a moment when people in Canada, after 2 years of general complacency and asking the government for more restrictions, asking the government for more regulations, people in this country finally turned around and said no. It was also a moment when even the most generous media consumers, mainstream media consumers, had to reckon with the fact that you guys have no idea what you're doing. Or alternatively, you do know, and it's not good. So what happened on January 14th of 2022 of this year? The GoFundMe campaign started. Now, the GoFundMe campaign for the trucker convoy was fascinating because this was something that no one, even Tamara Leach, the woman who set it up, thought would do what it did. She said in a couple of videos in an interview I did with her that she expected to raise $20,000, buy a little bit of diesel for some truckers. If there was a bit left over, maybe they'd give something to some veteran groups. Well, does anyone know what that campaign ended at? Sort of. It ended at 0, actually. It took a detour to 8 million and then went back to 0. Now, how that happens in a grassroots fundraising campaign is big tech. GoFundMe decided this was illegal. Now, we talk a lot about big tech censorship, and big tech bears a lot of the blame for this. But big tech was taking its orders from the government. They've acknowledged as much. From Ottawa Police, from Ottawa City Council, perhaps from other levels of government. We don't know yet the entire scope of that. So then what did the convoy do? They did what they did every single time someone put a roadblock in place. They went somewhere else. They started a Give, Send, Go campaign. Now, this one you already know is a trick question, but does anyone know what the Give, Send, Go campaign ended up at? Yes. Again, took a detour to $10 million in a fraction of the time as the first fundraising campaign did. US dollars, by the way. I think that's about 47 million Canadian some days. And then it too effectively went to zero when it became illegal for that money to cross from the US into Canada. So a narrative was forming that there must be something wrong with these people if their money's getting caught up. There must be something wrong. Is it foreign funding? Is it terrorism? My personal favorite was the CBC interview that suggested Russian actors were responsible. At first, I thought she meant the people that were in Fiddler on the Roof, but no, she meant like Russian agents, Russian activists, not actors. The Russians were behind the convoy. Now, I met a lot of people when I was in Ottawa. I don't know if I met a single Russian. There might have been a Russian there, I don't know. But you had two groups of people that were looking at the same thing and drawing vastly different conclusions. You had the truckers, you had the supporters, you had the people in this room that looked and saw a fun-loving group of people advocating for their freedoms, and you had the media that looked and saw foreign-funded hate mongers, racists, neo-Nazis, misogynists, or just generally speaking, a group with unacceptable views. A fringe minority, you might even say. Yes, let's give it up for the fringe. So going to Ottawa for the first time on January 28th, it would have been the Friday before the convoy was officially set to roll in, you already had dueling narratives that have been brewing for the last week. And I want to take a few moments and explain how those narratives form, because this was an entirely grassroots campaign. And there was a danger in a grassroots campaign because you can't stop something that has momentum like that. This was not top down. So whenever the Liberals, whenever the media put this organizer posted this on social media in 2009, or this person said this in a TikTok video, it didn't really matter. Because the people that were showing up to support the convoy weren't taking their marching orders from anyone. They were doing it because they believed in it. They were doing it because they believed in the fundamental idea. It was called the Freedom Convoy. There were two constituent parts of that, freedom and convoy. And all you needed to do to be a part of the movement was to believe in the freedom part. You didn't even need to believe in the convoy part. It didn't matter how you got to Ottawa, you were welcome if you were there and you believed in freedom. So this groundswell started, and it was all word of mouth. It was all TikTok videos, Facebook. I'm one of the younger people in the rooms. I don't even have a TikTok. It was happening, and then the mainstream media at first ignored it. Maybe they didn't know about it. Maybe they didn't want to cover it. But as the campaign got more and more money, as the maps were there, as the deadline neared, when those trucks were going to head out from BC on January 23rd, very little coverage. I've done an assessment just this week and found there were less than a dozen articles about the convoy, and most of them were very regional in focus. This group from Swift Current, Saskatchewan is going to head out. This group of Quebec truckers is going to head out. Very few reporters, in fact, no reporters before January 22nd actually understood the national scale and scope of what was happening. The first tactic was to dismiss. Well, actually, that was the second. The first was to ignore. The second was to dismiss. Say, yeah, there might be some truckers doing this thing, but they aren't really a thing. There aren't really that many of them. And then that didn't work either, because people saw, well, there are a lot of people doing this. I'm seeing lots of truckers on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter that are posting about going. I'm hearing from people that are going. So it's not nothing. I don't know how big it is. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's not nothing. Then it became very clear that the tactics of dismissing, the tactic of ignoring, were not going to cut it. So what was next? Vilification. The Canadian Trucking Alliance made this very easy for a lot of the convoy's critics. This is a group that ostensibly holds itself up as being representative of the trucking industry, and it does represent thousands of truckers. The Trucking Alliance had actually criticized the vaccine mandate for cross-border truckers because they saw that truckers had less than the general population as far as their vaccination rate. At some point in the next few weeks, the Trucking Alliance changed its tune and said, well, most truckers are vaccinated. This doesn't represent us. If you want to protest policy, you should write a letter to your MP. Yeah, that'll do it. But this actually became very useful because then it became the basis around which every other criticism in the media and from politicians came. Well, even the Canadian Trucking Alliance says this isn't a real thing. Well, even they say that most truckers are vaccinated. And what was interesting, when the Canadian Trucking Alliance put out its initial condemnation of the vaccine mandate, they gave very specific numbers of their estimates for Canadian truckers and American truckers that were unvaccinated. When they put out their statement condemning the convoy, they gave no numbers. They just said most truckers are vaccinated. Most is 50% plus one. So theoretically, you could take half of your workforce out of the running, almost, half minus one, and still be satisfying that criteria. So it was clear there was, again, a political battle at foot that was going against this groundswell, that was going against this grassroots movement. Vilification for a couple of days worked. And then January 23rd came. And if anyone saw an overpass or the side of a highway between January 23rd and January 29th, you knew that the convoy had already won. By this point, it has been called a fringe minority with unacceptable views. The media has said this is not really representative of truckers. The trucking industry has condemned it. Of course, word didn't get out to the members of the trucking industry that had created this protest in the first place. And every single time the convoy got to a new town, which, by the way, they had a schedule, they had an itinerary. It was blown to pieces by like 3 hours in. Like, you can't coordinate on a national scale a trip like that and keep an hour-by-hour itinerary, which was more incredible because in January, people were showing up to a highway in the morning knowing at some point trucks would be coming by and at some point they would be able to cheer. And these got larger and larger and larger. And the media coverage didn't reflect this. The media coverage didn't really share this at all. At one point, and this was my personal favorite of all the media bias, there were some really insane examples of media bias. My personal favorite, on January 23rd, CBC ran a story in British Columbia that truckers were in a convoy protesting road conditions. So when there were so many trucks on the road, they were protesting the weather. And it was only after pushback, they finally put like a little line, oh, this is different from the other convoy, which is the one that actually has the trucks, not like the 5 people that didn't like that the roads were a bit icy in January. And British Columbians, though, that's the kind of thing they protest. Sorry, Doug. The fascinating thing about this, though, was that it didn't matter. People weren't turned away from joining this convoy. People were emboldened. The money that was being raised, which was going up rapidly, and by this point it had cleared 7 figures and was growing even more, had originally been to cover fuel. But then it became something that they were going to extend to lodging, to food. They didn't need to buy food because every time they stopped, grandmothers notably, but people would just show up with sandwiches, with wraps, with muffins, with baked goods. People would just show up and shower the truckers with food, with money. They'd go to truck stops and just wait by the pump. And anytime a truck with a Canadian flag came, they would say, I'm going to pay for you to fill your truck up with diesel. And this was an example of why none of the things that we'll get to in a few moments really succeeded in stopping the convoy, because you can't stop organic support. Not easily. You can't stop organic support. So the convoy is making its way to Ottawa. Ignoring it hasn't worked. Dismissing it hasn't worked. Vilification has not worked. Next thing is to concoct a conspiracy. Articles that started talking about violence, which had never happened. Still, we know in the subsequent 3 weeks never happened. But there was talk about violence. There was an expert that was quoted in one story, and I use expert in the loosest possible way, who said, just so you know, all of these people donating to the convoy could be charged with financing terror if the truckers do something. There are a lot of ifs in that. And that was what passed for journalism in one particular example. But they needed violence. because every other way that they tried to delegitimize the convoy had failed. And the media wanted violence. The Liberal government wanted violence because that was the only way they knew that they could turn growing public opinion against this. So we'll fast forward to January 28th, January 29th. The convoy was originally scheduled to arrive in Ottawa on the morning of the 29th. It was not just one convoy that came from BC to Ottawa. There were a number of convoys. There was an East Coast leg. There was a Quebec leg. There was a Southern Ontario leg. There was another Southern Ontario leg. There was a Northern Ontario group. And more importantly, there were people that just showed up. They didn't care about the map. They didn't care about the routes. They didn't have a road captain. They didn't care about being reimbursed. They heard there's a convoy to Ottawa. They got in their trucks, their cars, their sedans, their Vespas, and they just showed up. And they did, not their Priuses, oddly, but again, you never know. They went to Ottawa, and interestingly enough, the original plan was for all of these groups to meet outside of Ottawa and drive in together. That didn't work. The people that had the best spots were ironically the ones that weren't even connected to the convoy because they just showed up early, parked on Wellington Street in front of Parliament Hill, and that was that. And a lot of them were the most stubborn. They were the ones that didn't want to move later on when they were trying to rearrange trucks. So I'm going to tell, as I talk about my own experience covering the convoy, a few of the stories that stood out to me that haven't really been told. And at the end, I'm going to try to wrap it up in a little bit of a bow and explain what it means. Because one thing I learned is that even when everyone was focused on the money didn't matter on the ground. And no one expected to be reimbursed, which was something that I found quite surprising. A lot of people were fine going out of pocket. And more importantly, a lot of people were already being made whole just by supporters that showed up and were giving them cash. There were people that were arranging these bulk fuel tanks to be brought to Ottawa that would then be filled up. Jerry cans would be filled up and brought in. And once that started happening, we know how that story ended. Police decided to stop the flow of fuel. And they started seizing jerry cans. And then what happened the next day? Jerry cans became the top fashion accessory in Ottawa, where everyone walking downtown had a jerry can. Empty, full, didn't matter. Police very quickly realized it wasn't worth it, and the fuel became irrelevant because it was already being dealt with. Some of the convoy organizers planned to have these massive purchases of food. They were sourcing from Costco's, from wholesalers, from distributors that restaurants use, how they can buy food for thousands and thousands of people. As I understand it, from organizers I spoke to, they didn't have to buy a single grain of rice because food just showed up. Food just showed up. People just showed up and said, we're bringing you soup, we're bringing you hot dogs, we're bringing you chickens, we're bringing you a hog you can put on a spit, we're doing it all. And it just happened. And what was interesting about this is that anyone who, and the media focuses on the organizers. Who was the organizers? Or who were the organizers, rather? Anyone who showed up and did something was an organizer. Now, the problem with that is that anytime one of those had said something inopportune, they became to the media, convoy organizer says this. And a few of the people that were in at the ground level would be reading stories about top convoy organizer Joe Jansen. And they'd be, well, actually, Joe Jansen's a real person, so that's a bad example. But they'd, read, Mary Scroggins and be like, who the heck is this person that's like apparently a top organizer? I've never seen her. I've never heard of her. But this was what the media did because they never understood it and they never tried to understand it. When I was there covering this, one of the things that I found my audience wanted the most was just to turn on the camera and walk around. Because even something as simple as a raw and unfiltered feed of what was happening on the ground in Ottawa was so difficult to find. You had reporters that were covering it from afar, that were terrified to go out. Now, I showed up in Ottawa. I'm a big guy, I realize, but I showed up in Ottawa alone. I had a videographer that met me so we could do some interviews easily and be mobile. The CBC and CTV reporters had 5-man teams, a reporter, a cameraman, a producer, and 1 or 2 bodyguards that would go around with them. And it's easy to chuckle at that. Actually, it is. I encourage you to chuckle at it. But the other part of that is that they genuinely were fearful. They were fearful of truckers. They were fearful of blue-collar Canadians. They were fearful of this violent narrative that they had created, or they knew they needed to commit to it. And admittedly, there were some very tense situations where people surrounded reporters and were heckling and shouting. I said to a couple of people, you're not helping your cause, because that becomes the only clip they get. That becomes the only clip that they have to put on the news. But again, it was an organic movement. No one could tell anyone to stop doing anything. No one could tell anyone to do anything. One fascinating example, and I'm jumping ahead in the timeline here, but I think it illustrates the point very well. There was near the end an agreement that had been reached between the convoy organizers and the police to move all of the trucks onto Wellington Street, away from the residential streets, and to then, in doing so, anyone that couldn't fit on Wellington Street would go outside of Ottawa, and they would rotate them. So people that wanted to be on Wellington Street would come in. Again, very sophisticated. They had tremendous relationships with Ottawa police, and they had agreed to do this. So convoy organizers, their lawyers, a couple of the lead road captains, they called them, go to this one particular intersection in Ottawa near the Chateau Laurier. So Rideau and Sussex, if anyone knows Ottawa well. And if you do, my condolences. And what they decided to do was get all of these trucks to move basically a block west towards Parliament Hill. The truckers had finally agreed. These were stubborn French-Canadian truckers. They didn't want to move because they thought it was a trap, but they finally agreed. In order to do this, they needed to remove these giant concrete barricades that the city of Ottawa had put in place, which could only be moved by heavy machinery. Again, they were worried about a truck driving through. So they brought in this heavy machine to move these barricades. A bunch of people that are there to support the convoy see this machine and say, they're coming to move the trucks. We can't let them do this. And 1,000 people within an hour surrounded the machine so they couldn't move it. Now, as it so happened, they were trying to help the truckers. But everyone there, without being told, without being ordered, saw that the convoy was being attacked. That's what they perceived, and they wouldn't let it happen. And eventually, those trucks never moved. They never got to move to Wellington Street until police ultimately removed them a few days later. But there was something very revealing in that about how they could offer the organizers leadership. They could say, we'd like you to do this, but even they could not control the convoy protesters. They could not control the people. When the media was trying to pin on the folks in Ottawa, what was happening at Coutts border crossing, at the Windsor-Detroit border crossing, at Emerson, elsewhere, they weren't in communication. People just did it. And it becomes very difficult, in fact, some might say even impossible, to go after a movement that has no leader. And that became the convoy's great success. And when you look at some of the smaller successes that tended to motivate the people that were there, Aaron O'Toole's ousting as Conservative leader, Alberta and Ontario finally coming out with a clear end to the vaccine passports and the mask mandates. In Ottawa, the mask mandate was no longer enforced. I have not found a single public health fine that was issued.
Years of diesel that's been brought in to keep the truckers running, which they need, of course, to keep themselves warm. They've said that they're going to arrest anyone who brings, quote, material support, unquote. That could be fuel. It could also be food. But when the Ottawa police chief calls it a siege, it doesn't quite align with photos you see of children playing on bouncy castles, people singing, worship services. So there are very much two dual
who were coming forward. Kept coming. It wasn't just one arrival. Trucks kept arriving. There was one point where they were rearranging trucks, and one of the organizers found there were 30 outside of Ottawa waiting to come in. And they're like, who are these people? Where did they come from? No one knew. But they were there, and they wanted to support it. So what happened in the next few weeks, as I mentioned earlier, the bouncy castles, the saunas, the pig roasts, it was very violent. There was a 6-year-old who I believe sprained her elbow on the bouncy castle. It was quite terrible. And I think someone chipped a tooth on the pig roast. It was, again, just horrible carnage that was being unleashed on the streets of Ottawa. And what was fascinating about all of this is that they had their own community, and it worked. It never devolved into violence. It never devolved into chaos. And when you look at what the media focused on, it was the desecration of Terry Fox statue. Desecration, by the way, has now been redefined as placing a flag and a sign that can be removed in the 3 seconds it took them on there. Stealing food from the homeless. Now, this story I will focus on because when I was on the ground covering this, what happened was I would be walking around and then I'd go back to my hotel room to recharge my phone, to warm up. And I've had some great conversations. I've been at ground zero, if you will. And I log on Twitter, and all of these people that aren't in Ottawa are talking about big controversies of, oh my goodness, they were stealing food from the homeless and the Terry Fox statue and all of this. And I'm like, I was just there. So these things, to some extent, happen. The homeless story, I'll explain, because that still is cited as a myth. It was cited by the Prime Minister. It's been cited by cabinet ministers. What happened there, someone or a group of people may have gone to a homeless shelter and asked for food. Now, still, that's entirely possible. You had thousands of people there. Not going to say it didn't happen. When the Convoy protesters at large learned about this, they took all of the food that they had been cooking up and went to the homeless shelter and were turned away because they had no way to accommodate that much food. That was what happened. And then when the media was reporting it, hundreds of thousands of dollars of donations flowed in to that shelter. The truck convoy was not just feeding the homeless, but housing the homeless. They had camps set up where people that were homeless were staying in Ottawa and receiving, by all accounts, a level of companionship they hadn't had in years. And these were some of the stories that still, even the most convoy sympathetic people I've spoken to have never heard, because these stories were simply not told. And what was so devastating about all of these people that were there is that they, for 2 years, had felt ignored. And they continue to be ignored by the elites, vilified by Trudeau. And as much as people tended to be quite amused by the fringe minority label, which quickly was reclaimed, as they say, people were quite proud of it, the media still did not take a lesson from this, with a small number of exceptions. One of the most amazing reporters who covered the convoy was a National Post columnist by the name of Rupa Subramanya. And her work was very simple. She lived in Ottawa. She would spend every day doing something that, again, it's quite a radical concept in the media, admittedly, because it's a tactic that not everyone's aware of the existence of. She went and talked to people. I know. I mean, how would she think of something so off the wall? She went and just talked to people. Who are you? Why are you here? What's your story? And in doing so, she kept this story of the convoy alive, which was always a story about the people. It was a story about the people, it was a story about their trucks, and it was a story about their frustration. A frustration that was never met by action from the federal government, that never entertained the idea of, let's just send a deputy, assistant deputy to a backbench member of parliament to meet with these people. Absolutely nothing. So I want to skip ahead a little bit to the end. Or I shouldn't say the end, but to the end of the Ottawa experience. Because what had happened was, and I went back on, I think it was the Wednesday before, and it was the Family Day weekend in February in Ontario. Everyone thought that the convoy had a few more days left, because on weekends, the population would balloon. You had a few hundred people that would stay during the week. On weekends, the out-of-towners would come, and it would just become insane. This time was a bit different because the police and the government, it's believed, had started booking up hotel rooms so no one else could stay. I got a copy of the manifest from one hotel in Gatineau, Quebec, which is just across the river. And at this particular hotel, the bill, by the way, of your tax dollars was $540,000 to house police at one particular hotel. And I looked at the list and noticed that a lot of the rooms were empty, but they were still being booked and paid for. And again, I can't extrapolate necessarily to other hotels, but I know it was happening. The Chateau Laurier, a lovely hotel if anyone's ever stayed there, was the official host of the buffet for police. And the buffet, I mean, Danny, I don't know what your costs are here, but they paid $300,000 just in buffet costs alone. Yeah. Well, it'll get frozen, but you can try. So we get to the end, and Coots border crossing has been effectively cleared. The Windsor border crossing has been effectively cleared. The convoy movement, as a physical protest, exists basically in Ottawa, and that's it. You have some little isolated things, but it exists in Ottawa. The trucks are on their way to Wellington Street. The trucks are out of residential areas. The honking which admittedly everyone hated, even the organizers. The honking has basically stopped, except for the odd honk. And it's become peaceable. It had always been peaceable, but especially at this point. Members of Parliament for 3 weeks have been walking through it to get to work because that was their only way, and there hadn't been a single issue reported, even by a Liberal or NDP member of Parliament that I saw. Time was running out if you were going to make this group out to be a violent, anarchical group of thugs. And I remain convinced that the timing of the Emergencies Act was because they knew that if they had let it go even a couple of days longer, there would have been no way whatsoever to justify urgency, because the trucks would have been even more concentrated in downtown Ottawa. There would have been no convoy presence at any other border crossings. And when the Emergencies Act came in, Trudeau said it was a last resort. Last resort implies you've tried at least one other thing before that, which hadn't happened. At the very least, that you might have talked to someone, which never happened. So when the Emergencies Act got invoked, what we saw from the federal government was an immediate takeover of the Ottawa Police Service, effectively. The Ottawa Police Service, which for all its faults, had been negotiating through the City of Ottawa with the truckers and having success. The City of Ottawa, whose police had been in constant communication with the convoy organizers. And I'm not going to give the Ottawa Police Service a complete pass on how they handled things, but I will say that it looks that the federal government was not happy with the conciliatory relationship that they had. Because again, it made it very difficult to concoct an emergency, which the federal government needed to do. Marco Mendicino, the federal public safety minister, gave a press conference in which he had said that there was a violent cell planning violent things that was connected to a group of people that were arrested in Coutts, of which there are still a great many questions, by the way. A reporter, to their credit, asked him, well, what evidence do you have? And it took 4 or 5 times asking the question before this link, this evidence of a violent cell in Ottawa, came walked back by Marco Mendicino himself to, well, I've seen some things on social media. I've seen a lot of things on social media too. I didn't know that was empowering me to just make things up. But that was what happened. They had to create this idea of an emergency. So the convoy organizers on the ground thought that they had until Monday or Tuesday. They thought that people would be able to get into the city. The numbers would become too great. Ottawa Police, RCMP, did a very good job at preventing people from getting into downtown Ottawa. So it became just dealing with the stuff that was there. So in the few minutes I have left, I'll talk very briefly about how this ended. And a lot of it's been documented. My own experience, which reduced me to one eye for a little while, took place moments, actually, almost at the exact moment that the horse trampled the woman by the name of Candace Serro. And it was partially because of that I got pepper sprayed, because police had been advancing slowly and steadily over the morning, moving a few feet every 10 to 15 minutes. And they had always kept a straight line that spanned from the building on one side of the street to the building on the other. Something happened that I think was a mistake, where the police broke their line. The horses went through the crowd, and the police actually ended up pushing people against the sides, which meant some people, myself included, were actually pinned up against a wall with nowhere to go. And I was with a couple of other journalists there filming this horse incident, which I heard just gasps and screams, and I turned. And then when I turned back, police had moved considerably in my direction. And I was still trying to move back, running backwards, avoiding trying to fall on the ground, which in a crowd situation can be deadly. And then there was about 10 feet between me and the front line of the police. So I thought I was in a safe spot. And then there's just a moment, and I realized that my left eye has been completely pepper sprayed. And being the good journalist and millennial that I am, I immediately took a selfie and posted it to Twitter. I defend that by calling it evidence in the forthcoming lawsuit against the Ottawa Police Service. But what was interesting about this particular moment is that it was the first time anyone had been injured in the convoy. And it wasn't at the hands of the truckers. It wasn't at the hands of the protest movement. It wasn't even at the hands of some renegade who had infiltrated. It was at the hands of the police empowered by the Emergencies Act for an emergency that did not exist. Now, as it so happens, I got pepper sprayed 2.5 times total. And I'll end by explaining how that happened. The next day was a little bit better. Now, I don't know if it's because I got less pepper spray or by this time I had natural immunity, which the federal government says doesn't exist, but you never know. And I think I just got a misting of it when the wind blew in my direction. The third one I don't blame police for. I had dealt with the condensation of the melting snow on my face, and I just wanted to wipe it off, and I had a toque nearby. And I took my toque, which I had been wearing for the first 2 pepper sprays, and wiped my face, which proved to be not the wisest decision. I didn't blame the government for that one. But what happened in covering the convoy revealed how little truth mattered to the media and to the government. And on the Sunday, after the trucks had been cleared, the battle wasn't over, because now police decided they were going to arrest anyone that was walking down the street. And you could technically claim, even under the Emergencies Act, that if you were a journalist, you had a lawful purpose for being there. So police would say, why are you walking down the street? I say, I'm a journalist. They say, prove it. I say, well, how? There's no license to be a journalist in this country. What they actually were asking for was the certification card for the Parliamentary Press Gallery, which is something that most Ottawa journalists have because most of them are government approved. I don't have because I'm evidently not government approved. And I think after the last 30 minutes, I don't think I will be anytime soon. It was interesting because a lot of the police officers didn't know. They just assumed that there was some centralized card. Some turned me away. One threatened me with arrest. One let me through when I showed him my Twitter profile, and he just was convinced that I was conducting something that resembled journalism, which in Canada is all you need. I mentioned this yesterday. Press freedom is not a category of its own. Press freedom is a subset of freedom of expression, which means my right as a journalist to walk down the street was no stronger than any of your rights to walk down the street and invoke your freedom of expression. But that was outlawed. Peaceful protest was outlawed. The Emergencies Act, if you read through the text, did not apply to the Ottawa protest. And this is something that, again, you won't see on CBC or in the Toronto Star. The Emergencies Act specifically said that lawful protest was allowed. And it defined unlawful protest as protest at critical infrastructure, which it did not classify Parliament Hill as. Interference in the movement of goods or people. Again, you could argue that does apply to border crossings, did not apply to Parliament Hill. And third, when there is a threat to public order and public safety, which no one claimed about the Ottawa protest. Even if it was implied, no one claimed it and no one invoked it. So someone saying, I'm going to Parliament Hill to protest was never prohibited in law. Even if you accept that the Emergencies Act was lawful, which I don't, but even if you do, it was never prohibited. But that didn't matter on the ground when peaceful assembly was being prohibited, when the mainstream media, when police were effectively conspiring to say that you did not have a right to be there as a Canadian. And covering the convoy, for me, revealed how much you are up against, how much resistance there is if you are prepared to take a stand for freedom. And what they wanted was for you to say, okay, it's not worth it. And what Canadians said is, no, it's more worth it. Thank you very much.
So we've got time for a couple of questions. I thought you were going to announce you were moving back to Alberta. Yeah,
back? I've never been here.
Oh, you've never been here? Okay, well, maybe are you going to, anyway, do we have a question?
I'll crowdfund it, but your bank account's will all get frozen.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead, Donald, ask a question. The question's got to be short because we don't have a lot of time, so no speeches.
I'm sorry. Andrew, did you see or hear any evidence that some of these police were not really Canadian police? I have heard from a number of different people, but it's always, through so-and-so, a guy I know whose brother was there said the police on the front line were speaking German. Other people said they weren't speaking at all. They were totally silent. Like, who were these guys? And then there's the UN airplanes coming into North Bay. Did you see or hear any evidence of that?
Thank you. So the UN airplane, completely a non-story. There's a company in North Bay that for years has had a contract on maintenance of UN aircraft. It's not new. It's not to do with the Convoy. So that was not a story. The stories about foreign police I've heard, I have not seen any evidence of it. And you know, as far as police not speaking, they were fairly, I mean, a lot of police that I spoke to personally hated what they were being asked to do. And the only way, especially when they were in a riot formation, that they could keep with what they were doing is to basically dehumanize and depersonize the people they were up against, which meant they were doing the whole beefeater thing of no engagement, no response, no speaking to people. So I've seen no evidence of foreign police. In fact, quite the contrary, there were police from all over the country there. And I think just in the thousands and thousands of police officers from Quebec, from Ontario, from Alberta that were being shipped there, I don't think the government would have had a difficult time filling the law enforcement roles that they had. Thank you.
Go ahead, Troy.
So, Andrew, you have confirmed to me that the invocation of the Emergency Act was strictly political and not based on a real emergency. And Trudeau just wanted this out of there so that it wouldn't be focusing on him. So my question has to do with the financial aspects of the Emergency Act and why it continues probably to be applicable to this day. And there was a few days there when I was feared that I might have my accounts frozen because some donkey had leaked the whole list of donors to the Give, Send, Go fund.
Yeah, thank you, Foon. And I didn't get into it because I could deliver a whole hours-long talk about the financial aspect alone. But I think that there are two primary concerns here. The first is the precedent. You had people that had never been accused of a crime, convicted of a crime, at the time were donating to something that had never been subject to any criminal accusations. No one had been charged at the time that these financial measures were put in place. And I know whataboutism is difficult for people, but what-ifism is important. What if Stephen Harper had done it to some Indigenous protest, some anti-pipeline protest? What if? There would be riots in the street. You'd have a UN delegation coming. You'd have inquiries from every country and every international human rights body imaginable. So the precedent is significant there. I think that there was also the chilling effect. People like, I don't know where Foon went, but people like Foon who donated, who were nervous that their accounts would be frozen just because they donated. True North donors, JCCF donors, Rebel donors, they were all nervous. And a lot of people emailed and said, I'd love to donate, but I can't afford to have my accounts frozen, even though it never extended to other groups. And by the way, it didn't extend to the vast majority of actual donors. Police said they froze a little over 200 accounts, and most of those were unfrozen relatively quickly, although their credit scores of a lot of those people have still been harmed, in some cases irreparably. The one thing I would add on that as well, when you're talking about the money, is that the government thought that the money was fueling the convoy. And that was a miscalculation, because for all the reasons that I did speak about, it wasn't the money that was fueling it. Cutting off the money just made more people show up with cash. Cutting off the fuel made more people show up with fuel. So every time they tried to do it, they were astonished that it ended up being so insignificant, because people just weren't going to be dissuaded by it. They weren't going to be discouraged. And that was the one thing I think the government severely thought that cutting off the money would end it, and not even close.
Go ahead, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Ted, for this. It's been wonderful to see it through your eyes. Actually, it makes us feel like we were there. There's a side to the convoy, of course, where you had all these wonderful speakers, these people like Roger Hodkinson, like Paul Alexander, Brian Peckford, Maxime Bernier. They did a lot of work openly, but also in the background as to encourage this and to let people know in Canada, and this was not reported by mainstream media, that this was just for freedom. This was not for anything other than they just wanted the right to decide whether or not they wanted the vaccination, the so-called vaccination, etc. So that was a side that was, I'd like to know how the people in the convoy saw it. Another point of my question is, when is your book coming out? And the last, and again, to thank you very much for all you've done for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was funny, moments, literally seconds earlier, Danny whispered to me, he said, I guess we're not talking about your book, right? And I said, no, not today. So thank you for that, Nicole. So I am writing a book about the convoy. I didn't want to announce it formally because I don't have anything to share about release date. But I will say on that, I started writing it because I wanted to read it. And I was talking to other people and just thinking, I got to read, someone's got to write a book on this. And then finally someone said, oh, shut up already and write it yourself. So I started. And that's going to be a project over the course of the summer because there was so much. And I've just scratched the surface of it that people didn't really hear and understand. So thank you for that. As far as the people you mentioned that were working in the background and people that were speaking, it was actually one of the only real sources of internal tension that I've unearthed just talking to people involved in the convoy was a lot of the jockeying over who speaks for the convoy. And you had a lot of different groups and organizations that were coming there, all with very pure motives, that all wanted to add something to the discussion and add something to the debate. And the convoy organizers, and when I say organizers in this context, I'm talking about the core group that had been involved in the GoFundMe campaign and the ones who generally were speaking and holding press conferences, but not exclusively. And what was interesting for them is that they early on said they didn't want any politicians. They didn't want any politicians there because they wanted this to be a grassroots, nonpartisan movement. And of course, with all due respect to Paul Hinman and other politicians here, some of the most dangerous places to be in this country are between politicians and microphones. So what happened is a lot of people that were there, that were sympathetic, were wanting to speak and support it. And that ended up happening. And it wasn't really something that anyone could prevent. But there were, the only politicians they really wanted to pay attention were people in government that were prepared to take a stand and end the mandates. And that was what they wanted, and that didn't happen in the way that they were after. But I think generally speaking, a lot of the people there were very diverse. And I don't just mean ethnically and religiously, although they were, but they were very diverse in their background. Some people were there because they were double, triple vaccinated, and they were just against vaccine mandates. Other people were there because they had very scientific and medical objections to vaccination. Other people were there because they believed that their religious freedom had been under attack through the pandemic. And all of these people were coming, and they were all getting along. The fact that I saw Alberta separatists and Quebec separatists that were like hugging and laughing and dancing, like that's not something you see, even in fora like this. So I did think that a lot of the people that were speaking up, that were adding something to the discussion, they were definitely part of the convoy story.
Go ahead, Bob.
My question is going to be how you respond to my perception of events. And I first have to declare that I am a proud member of a fringe minority with unacceptable views.
Hear, hear.
And I donated twice to the convoy. You've mentioned how successful they were in many respects, and I quite agree with what you said, but I also think that they made some fatal errors. Fundamentally, they were an extraordinarily naive organization. Well, to the extent there was an organization. They came to Ottawa demanding freedom. Well, okay, what precisely is freedom? They honked for too long, they stayed for too long, and they had unbelievably unrealistic demands initially. Essentially what they asked originally is that they wanted the Governor General and the Senate to remove the Prime Minister. Well, I'm sorry, if you've taken a high school civics course in Canada, you should know that that's not how government works. So they made it very, very easy for the government to just ignore them as a bunch of people that were very naive and uninformed. They should have been far more strategic and informed in what they asked for. And of course, that doesn't excuse the government. The government, as a former public servant, I can tell you the government could have very easily dealt with this. All they would have had to do as you say, would have been to send a deputy minister or an assistant deputy minister out to the leaders or whichever group that were prepared to represent the leaders and say to them, we are prepared to remove whatever restrictions there are in these circumstances. And then there would have been a discussion about what are the circumstances and whether they're acceptable or not. But they never had that dialogue. The government never chose it as a way of diffusing the situation, and the truckers never asked for it. So I absolutely support them, but I think that they have set a bad example as to how future protests should be made.
Thank you. And with that question, I now begin my other 30-minute talk. No, I do appreciate that, Bob, and I think you actually touch on a couple of important things. And where I take issue with it is the use of the word they. And this goes back to the problem I identified a few moments ago of who speaks for the convoy. So I'll try to address those things very briefly. The memorandum of understanding, which is what you're referring to about this plan to have the Governor General and the Senate combined, that was never, ever part of the convoy. That predated the convoy, and it was by one person who had a website, actually someone in Calgary who had a website, and on his website, he offered to put the maps and the itineraries and the routes. And on his website, he also had this memorandum of understanding, which he had brought to Ottawa in December. And the whole thing is complete nonsense. It's babble, it's legalese, it's gobbledygook. And the convoy organizers, a few of them didn't even know about it until they were getting asked about it by the media. And they're like, what is this thing? So it was never part of that. But the problem that the convoy had is that anyone who showed up was allowed to join. So people that did have their own plans and agendas and initiatives were all part of this core group of people. And that was a big problem. And I think the naivete you identify is correct in a couple of key ways. I think they needed to be a lot more clear early on about distancing themselves from some of these things, but they were trying to not be in the business of making enemies. They were trying to not make enemies, especially among their supporters. And I think that was to their detriment. I don't agree that their goal was abstract. I think, yes, the convoy was branded about freedom, but they were very clear in their messaging that they wanted to end the mandates and the passports. That was it. And I do think, though, that they didn't communicate that as clearly because they didn't really have a unified voice. They had Chris Barber's TikTok and Tamara Leach's Facebook page and Benjamin Dichter's Twitter page. And the Freedom Convoy set up a Facebook page, but that was more to communicate, things that were logistical details. It wasn't really forward-facing. And I do think that would have been, and again, I've interviewed some convoy organizers who disagree with me on this. They say, no, we did put our message out early. The media wasn't picking it up. And I say, well, I was pretty favorable media, and I wasn't getting a clear manifesto, for lack of a better term. So I think there needed to be more clarity. So as far as the stayed too long, if the convoy showed up, partied for a weekend, and left, what would the story be? And I don't have the answer to that. Would everyone cheer it on and say, great, mission accomplished? Or would it have become a flash in the pan? And that, I think people will draw their own conclusions. They were clear early on they were going to stay until the mandates were gone, which is when police said, we have no idea how long they're going to be here. I said, well, you may not like it, but they've told you. And there's a story, I'm sorry, Danny, if I'm going on too long, but there's one story I wanted to tell, because the sophistication in some cases of the organization was very strong. In other cases, it was very haphazard, people just making it up as they went along. And one fantastic example, Chris Barber, who was, one of the first organizers of the convoy, he's a very prolific TikTok user. And he did one video at one point where he said, this was near the end, he said, guys, things are heating up in Ottawa. We're going to take our trucks out and we're going to go to Toronto tomorrow. The next day, Toronto police have blocked off the roads. Traffic is snarled at morning rush hour in Toronto. And then Chris Barber does another video, and he says to one of the gentlemen that was also involved, he had said, hey, that was kind of fun what we did yesterday, wasn't it? So that I thought was a great enough story as it was. Even better was when the Toronto police chief later on gave a press conference in which he talked about the sophisticated counterintelligence operations that the convoy is running. And I'm like, are you talking about Chris Barber's TikTok? I think so. All right.
Come on, Stephen. This is your last question. This is our last question. But I think this is important stuff. We can work it in.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Just
Go
quick
ahead.
question. So there, Nicholas St. Louis on the ground there, and the reason I asked is because you were there. I wish I could have made it, but so he ended up raising 20.7 Bitcoin. It was about $1 million, just over $1 million, and he got about 800,000 out to the truckers. So I was wondering if you had talked to anybody that went through that process. Was it painful or?
He's Nobody Caribou. Is that his name?
I think so.
Okay.
Caribou. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I mentioned earlier about how anytime one door closed, another one opened, near the end, Bitcoin became the preferred method of donating for a lot of people electronically. Now, I'm not a Bitcoin person at all. I am now. I wasn't at the time. I've become one because of the Emergencies Act. And there were a group of people that had arranged the donation of, it was about $1 million worth of Bitcoin that was then, they had set up a system to distribute. Because if I were to go up to one of you and said, I'd like to give you, half a Bitcoin, you'd be like, what? Can I buy my coffee with that? A lot of people didn't know. So that what they did is that this one gentleman, they had worked out a plan where they gave people these instructions on how to access it, and they had broken it up, and I forget how much each little package was worth. And they went around and they handed out to individual truckers these packages. And with Bitcoin, you can track on a public registry the transactions. So they were being withdrawn. And once it was diffused like that, the government really couldn't go after it. So it did work. It did have some success. But the one thing as well is that by this point, a lot of the truckers had already been given a lot of cash too, which is even less traceable and trackable than Bitcoin. But this example, and you can still see online the manifest, or not the manifest, but the instructions on how truckers could access this, because they posted it all very publicly because they knew that people were going to be raising concerns about folks making off with large sums of money, which I've heard, but I've seen no evidence of. So yeah, the Bitcoin pivot was just one of many examples of where these truckers were just being, given so much support from people, even when the government tried to ban and tried to prohibit it. And the courts have frozen some Bitcoin wallets of the heavy hitters, not of, as I understand, the truckers that received it, but they have in a lot of cases no way of actually seizing it. So it's just on paper that they've claimed it, but they haven't actually physically been able to take possession. So no, it's again another not the success story I understand as well, but still is, I think, a success story. Thank you for asking that.
This is him. This is
seconds after.
Seconds after.
Yeah.
Well, we've got, as you say, Exhibit A.
Yeah.
Well,
I look like that on a good day, though.
Let's have a warm thank you for Exhibit A.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. You've exceeded our expectations again. So it's coffee time. It's coffee time with no coffee. Have a glass of water and be back in 10 minutes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
No, short answer, not a preference. When I talk about this, I want it to be on record that the major media folks are relying. So I'm trying to focus on the story on this. Yeah. You said make it write it for yourself. Yeah, and I've got publishers that are very supportive of it, that want it out there. And I'm taking stuff things like the emergency act, a lot of statements that I'm trying to get into. I'm trying to say yeah. Yeah, and because I've been living this now for the last month, writing about it, I have so much to say about that, but I didn't want to. It would be great. Yes. It would be great if yeah. Oh, I would love it. Well, maybe they can option my book if they. Yeah. Yeah. Hey there. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, where's our Canadian milk? Yeah. So I'm turning the tape, right? Thank you. I really appreciate that. And that's what I'm doing. Trust me, that's what I'm doing. But that's why it's been so difficult to write what I'm working on, because every time I think I've captured it, I learn of some other aspect of it that informs somewhere else. So, sorry. Yeah. No, hey, thanks for your question. So. An illegal occupation, overthrowing the government, yeah. A lot of people were in that boat, yeah. Because once they learned that all these people wanted to stop it, they're like, well, now I'm definitely donating to it. Really good. So, I heard that the two yeah. Yeah, yeah. So what happened? So it's still that money, and so what would happen was, GoFundMe originally released $1 million after they had been satisfied with what we were doing, and also Tamara Lisa received about $400,000 in direct interest. She had pulled out, I think it was $30,000, and then TD froze it. And then when the court injunction came, or when the lawsuit over the honking came, that lawyer saw the $10 million and said we can cash in on this. So then the court seized that money, and now it's an escrow pending the outcome of litigation. So so this is the thing. People saw $10 million. All the Convoy got in direct electronic donations was $30,000. That was it, and that was gone. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. That's it. How are you doing? Yeah. 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 Yeah, I mean, so my email is andrew@andrewlawton.ca. It's just immediately I'd say kind of similar to my answer to Robert. They need to put on the record what they want. Now they also Convoy and I just have all of the data we need for the meeting. And the neat thing is they've been banning people for reporters from coming to press conferences. But I think it's still a mistake because I think they should have done it right at the end, and then they just sort of throw it back. Because instead the story just became about the secret. But again, but that I think is the big issue. They needed to put out more and some of them but again, right, it's also I don't think police knew how much was happening. Like they had 3 full-time operations. They were using to run security, relations, social media. They had an intelligence. But they were doing intelligence, and they claimed that they knew before a week ago or so without seeing yet. So they had all of this stuff in hand. That I think could have that I don't know how easily they can replicate. The best explanation came who said over the last year with all the government has fired doctors, nurses, soldiers, police, public service. All of these people that have incredible experience and operational know-how with nothing to do because they were fired. All of those people took those skills.
I would be seen. I know I was
Yeah. So again, you take this skill set that the government doesn't want, and you apply it, and then imagine take that on a national scale. That's what happens in Convoy. So you had all these military people that had these maps scrawled out on these tables that were literally making battles because that was their skill set.
amazing, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Really appreciate that. Yeah. Okay. I already have. Yeah, and that was one of the realized. Yeah. No government, capital, no, I
Yeah, yeah. So it's like groups and parties. What's the difference?
Yes.
Right. So like
Really? I didn't see this. They don't even have that covering. Well, yeah. That's the thing is, I wasn't a fan of a lot of it. I mean, it's worked against the purposes of people like yelling and screaming. I also think that they need to be. I think it was very jarring for a lot of young people. Yeah, exactly. But they think they do. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's kind of like, can we get that question?
Okay, folks. Okay, folks. Okay, we've got, just while everybody, I see some people still stopping at Michael and Ivy Wagner's table to pick up some books, and Nicole's over here peddling her buttons to keep, our infamous doctor on the road. And so let's start. Morning, Norm. Thanks for coming. We were afraid we'd offended you. Thanks for being here. Okay. Oh, okay. Well, maybe we'll offend you later, but we'll see. Okay, thank you. Anyway, so just a couple of things. Like I said, when you look at a whole bunch of this stuff, we would be well served to study our history. And Michael's got a couple of 3 books there at the back, which if you haven't got one, you should. And I was going to calculate out how many days it is till Christmas, but you can figure it out yourself and get started shopping. So anyway, it'll be before we know it. And we've got a couple of quick changes. Premier Peckford is going to speak at 12 o'clock our time. So we're going to have Michelle and Tammy speak, and instead of we're going to put the question and answer to after lunch. So when we might have time for one question, but we'll stop for lunch at about 11:25, 11:30 at the latest. Then we'll have lunch, and Mr. Peckford will be speaking right at 12 o'clock. So anyway. Here's one of the favorite parts of our sessions, Michelle. I don't think we'd met you, Michelle, before we started having our freedom conferences. So one more good reason for us having started these, because you become a dear friend and one of our most trusted presenters. So I think everyone who's familiar with what we're doing and what the Friends of Science are doing, and sometimes Michelle speaks on behalf of Friends of Science, and sometimes she just speaks on behalf of Michelle. So I guess you can tell me when you get here if you're speaking on your behalf or hers. And so please welcome Michelle Stirling.
Thank you. I'm speaking today on behalf of myself. Most of you probably know me as the spokesperson for Friends of Science, but I do come up with other crazy things of my own. So I will be mentioning some reports and blog posts of Friends of Science in this presentation. These are my own thoughts. So fundamental to the thesis of this presentation, to return to freedom, I believe that we must return to reality, an evidence-based policy world. So the things that Andrew just said that caught my attention were the frustration of the public wanting to be heard, and they were never heard by government in terms of the convoy. But that's been going on climate and COVID and healthcare in general. And also what Andrew said, how little the truth mattered to government and the media. So my presentation is Models versus Reality, Climate, COVID, Public Policy Disasters. So we look at COVID models from hero to zero. This was a Nature special report, April 3rd, 2020. Here we have Professor Lockdown, Neil Ferguson. I don't know if you know this, but Professor Lockdown helped save thousands of lives worldwide. And he carried COVID-19 into Downing Street. But look, Boris Johnson was going to just have herd immunity policies, rather like in Sweden. But Professor Lockdown convinced them that 500,000 people could die. And he convinced others around the world of the same thing. But look a couple of months later, and here's Professor Lockdown. He resigns in disgrace because he broke his own lockdown rules to have a tryst with his lover. And as we find out later in the article in the corner there, Imperial Folly, Neil Ferguson has no qualification in biological sciences, despite the fact in the preceding slide we see that they called him UK epidemiologist. And what do we find when we look on the Imperial College site? Well, look who they work with. AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, and Thomson Reuters. I don't know. I don't have evidence of undue influence, but someone should be asking that question, don't you think? And by the way, Professor Lockdown's girlfriend is a climate activist. So we look at what the real epidemiologists had to say in 2006 in Biosecurity and Bioterrorism magazine. They wrote about disease mitigation measures. So Inglesby, the first author, is an epidemiologist. Nuzzo is an epidemiologist. O'Toole is with Homeland Security in the US. And Henderson was a medical doctor known for his work in eradicating smallpox. And they said, if we look at the underlying part, if particular measures are applied for many weeks or months, the long-term or cumulative second and third order effects could be devastating socially and economically. And they also say, in brief, models can play a contributory role in thinking through possible mitigation measures, but they cannot be more than ancillary aid in deciding policy. But despite knowing this, destructive lockdowns proceeded. It's difficult to identify circumstances, they wrote, in the past half century when large-scale quarantine has been effectively used in the control of any disease. The negative consequences of large-scale quarantine are so extreme that this mitigation measure should be eliminated from serious consideration. So that's what real experts had to say long before this pandemic, and that was based on evaluation of what happened during SARS. So this slide shows that experience and facts don't matter, because when we look at Neil Ferguson's history, we find that he was behind the disputed research in the 2001 outbreak of foot and mouth disease. He predicted 150,000 people could die. There were fewer than 200 deaths. In 2002, he predicted 50,000 people would die from mad cow disease. There were 177 deaths. In 2005, he predicted 150 million people would die from bird flu. Only 282 people died worldwide from that disease between 2003 and 2009. In 2009, a government estimate based on Ferguson's advice said a reasonable worst-case scenario was that swine flu would lead to 65,000 British deaths. And in the end, swine flu killed 457 people in the UK. And last March, he admitted that his Imperial College model of the COVID-19 disease was based on an undocumented 13-year-old computer code that was intended to be used for a feared influenza pandemic rather than coronavirus. And he declined to release his original code. So this excerpt from a newspaper says, the real scandal is, why did anyone ever listen to this guy? And the media brought these questions up, but long after. So we now have deadly and painful consequences for millions of people in the world, but we're going to talk about Canada here. This is a CMA report, Canadian Medical Association report, that they did with Deloitte. They figure it'll take an additional $1.3 billion to bring us back up to the original wait times, which I think is a joke. But in the meantime, there have been 4,000 deaths from delayed or missed treatments. 2/3 of Canadians with chronic pain got no care. Cancer screenings were down 20 to 35% below pre-pandemic. There were 60,000 fewer home care assessments, 39% growth in food insecure population in the first 2 months of the pandemic. On the other side of the page, you can see Patients at Risk. This is an excellent book about healthcare in Canada by Susan Martinick. So the CMA Deloitte report does some accounting of these unintended consequences of lockdowns, but these numbers simply exacerbate the cruel reality for many patients in Canada, which are documented by Susan in her book. Canada has been rationing healthcare from the start of the Medicare program. Universal healthcare was never financially viable. They actually took people from Saskatchewan who had proved it wouldn't be financially viable in Saskatchewan, brought them to Ottawa, and had them put together the program for the national policy, which they knew would never be financially viable. So you never had a choice. So when we look at what's happening now, you've probably seen some headlines conflating climate and COVID, and sure enough, net zero healthcare made for you. Yes, there's actually a group of academics and health policy people who've written this paper for Nature, and they're actually claiming that in comparison to the COVID response, the task of transforming healthcare culture and practice to have healthcare emissions by 2030, that's to cut all healthcare emissions by 2030 in half, as recommended by the IPCC, seems entirely feasible. Look at the chart of global fossil fuel consumption. Does it look like we could cut 2.5% of emissions in that time period? So how does this relate to climate? Well, it's funny how these modeling things are making our lives very miserable. Modeling in climate science, we have this excerpt from the IPCC report in 2001, which says, in climate research and modeling, we should recognize that we're dealing with a coupled, nonlinear, chaotic system, and therefore long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible. This is exactly opposite to every headline that you read in mainstream media. And what is a chaotic, nonlinear system? This will give you a bit of an idea. This was done by Henri Masson. He's a chaotic systems expert in Belgium. And it gives you an idea that there's many different big factors at play. And you can see the little green dot there I added. That's our contribution. It's not to scale, but that's where we contribute in the atmospheric composition. So it's ridiculous to think that a carbon tax would address that. So, and what do we see here? The government is always saying we policy best on the best science available. Well, climate models project 2 to 3 times the observed warming, and you can see the bar graph here. The little gray bars that are flat on the right-hand corner or your left, that's the observed temperatures. The other bars are the modeled temperatures by various modelers around the world, and you can see that the hottest one is the Canadian model, right in the middle there. So, and modeling in climate science, this is from Dr. John Christie presentation. And let me just say something about models. Some people think that a model is just a scaled replication of what really goes on. You know, just like you have a B-52 bomber, and then you buy that little kit that's, 300 scale, 1/300 scale. that that's a model. That's not what these are. These are simulations. So it depends on who puts what in and how much. So, garbage in, garbage out. So modeling in climate science, you can see here there's a big line going up. That's an average of 102 different model runs from different modelers around the world. And across the bottom, you see there's like little circles. Those are the average of balloon data sets, of 4 balloon data sets. And every day they're sending up hundreds of weather balloons around the world and tracking the information. And the squares are the average of 2 satellite data sets. And you can see they quite closely parallel, and there's very little warming happening, certainly nothing like what's shown in those models. And I'm going to read this excerpt from something that is on Judith Curry's website. A special prize goes to the Canadian model. We draw attention to the CAN ESM5 model. It simulates the greatest warming in the troposphere, roughly 7 times larger than observed trends. The Canadian government relies on the CAN ESM models to provide science-based quantitative information to inform climate change adaptation and mitigation in Canada and internationally. Well, the problem with that is this. Basically, carbon taxes are evaluated or set by the social cost of carbon, the assumed damage that we might have in the future. And these are made by economic models, which are calibrated to climate models. So if your climate model is too hot, your carbon taxes will be too high. So we have a couple of pieces on the Friends of Science website with Dr. Ross McKittrick. He's explaining these issues in a series of short videos, and we also have this little guide that can help people understand these issues. So now we have, unfortunately, a disastrous confluence of reality. We have war. Climate policy of the West and Germany has created the opportunity for Putin's war or incursion into Ukraine. We have debt, the federal government budgetary deficit. This is a summary that Robert Lyman prepared for us from federal documents. The deficit rose from 5.6 billion in 2018 to 2019 to 312.4 billion in 2020 to 2021, an increase of 5,479%. The total interest-bearing debt of the federal government rose from 1.02 trillion in 2018 to 2019 to 1.44 trillion in 2020 to 2021. A 1% increase in interest rates would add $14.4 billion to annual federal debt servicing charges. We also have ballooning health costs. We have lack of access, and we have the COVID backlog. So in 2019, this is from Martin's book, our so-called free healthcare costs were expected to amount to $264 billion, or $7,069 for every Canadian. But that's not all. We have unfunded pension liabilities, and these are huge. And we have unattractive investment climate in Canada. So all Western nations, by the way, all Western nation pension funds are signatory to the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. This is a group of about 1,000 pension and mutual funds from around the world. They hold $90 trillion in assets under management, and their financial guru is Al Gore. So you can imagine where some of this money has been invested, but there have been losses. So, and also we have not kept up in Canada with funding these liabilities, these future liabilities. And I think Professor Lee and Bill Tufts have spoken on this in past conferences, and you can see their work on the FreedomTalk website. But simply put, aging Canada's population has resulted in large and growing unfunded liabilities. The funding shortfall is estimated at $792.3 billion for CPP, $494.4 billion for OAS, $894.7 billion for Medicare. And together with the unfunded liabilities in Canada's public pensions and healthcare programs, a total of $2.2 trillion, or $134,841 for every income taxpayer. That's from the Fraser Institute. And despite our estimated $21 trillion US in resource wealth, and this is from a blog that Robert put together for us, climate policies have actually made Canada hostile to investment. And this little clip is from PPHB Energy Bankers from Houston, which does a newsletter on a quarterly, bi-monthly basis called Musings. This was from April 2018. And that was just about the time that Kinder Morgan stopped work on TMX just before the government bought it. And it says, for the federal government in support of certain energy projects while fighting others has allowed itself to be positioned as both pro-energy and anti-energy. This split political personality is seen by the global energy industry as a sign that Canada has evolved into a hostile location to do business. For an industry that operates with decades-long planning and development timetables, this hostile attitude could cause long-term damage to Canada's economy, and especially its western provinces where the energy industry is centered. Energy hostility will also put the mining, timber, and other extractive industries on notice that their growth may soon be challenged. And we see that happening. We see that Equinor's offshore Bay du Nord project is being approved, and the oil sands is potentially being shut down or capped. And what is the solution that the government is proposing for this? This is like huge loss of revenue to us. Well, they're proposing to bring in 400,000 refugees or immigrants a year, and hoping that those people will become the new taxpayers to support all these indebted programs. And their ultimate plan is to bring in 63 million more immigrants by 2100 to Canada. Now, we all know that immigrants, wonderful as they are, need help when they first come to a country. They need support. Where is the money? So is there any hope? It's grim. Our situation is grim. I think we're going to have to make our own solutions. And ironically, I'm going to quote from the World Economic Forum blog. This woman, Ida Auken, is a member of parliament in Denmark. I think that this blog post has been taken down, but she's saying, welcome to 2030. I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better. But we see right at the top, she's identifying that people live different kinds of lives outside the cities. And she's saying, my biggest concern is all the people who do not live in our city, those we lost along the way. Those who decided it was too much, all this technology, those who felt obsolete and useless when robots and AI took over big parts of our jobs, those who got upset with the political system and turned against it. They live different kind of life outside the city. Some have formed little self-supplying communities. Others just stayed in the empty abandoned houses in small 19th century villages. So, and note that she says, once in a while I get annoyed that I have no privacy. They know everything about me. I just hope they won't use it against me. So what's the problem is also that I've seen many comments on Twitter now. There's an extremely deep lack of public trust in the healthcare system, in medical people, even though there are many great medical people out there. But in general, many people in the public are very distrustful of government, of the healthcare system. And we have a population that will need healthcare. What can we do? So in our reality check, we face a grim future. The cupboard is bare. Climate policy is a huge drain for the past 20 years for no benefit. Billions of dollars are being wasted on climate policies. Healthcare itself, as it is in Canada, is unsustainable. made regulations have been eased, many people in pain will probably opt for that route if there are no other choices. Perhaps the fired and rejected healthcare community can be reformed to serve people's needs at a community level, and this will require overturning legislation and challenging it. And obviously, as you've seen, the reliance on climate models and health models and not reality have destroyed the society that our ancestors built. And curiously, as I was just finishing this up popped this quote from Tommy Douglas, father of Medicare and universal healthcare in Canada. And I don't know where he said this, but apparently he said, "Once more, let me remind you what fascism is. I need not wear a brown shirt or a green shirt. Fascism begins the moment a ruling class, fearing the people may use their political democracy to gain economic democracy, begins to destroy political democracy in order to retain its power of exploitation and special privilege." So let's hope this is not the end of our society, but it's certainly going to need to get a grip on reality, and only then can we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions after. Okay. Thank you very much, Michelle. That was a great quote to end with. As you know, at one of the first conferences I went to, Kevin Avram helped us start our economic group. And, we went to a conference. He had Sir Roger Douglas from New Zealand speaking. And as you may or may not know, New Zealand went broke, and Sir Roger Douglas was the finance minister, and he was the finance minister in a socialist government. And he said some of his union people were complaining to him, and he said, "I thought you were one of us." And he said, "Well, actually, like the reason I'm a socialist is like I don't like groups having special privileges that no one else has, and quite frankly, you have special privileges that no one else has. So as much as I am one of you, like we're all going to have to get back to where we have the same privileges." And so it's interesting how we've gone. Our next speaker, Tammy, I just met Tammy, and this is another thing that we can. That I can thank Michael Binion and the Modern Miracle Network for. We met you, I think it was about 6 months ago. I think it was at a Modern Miracle function, and she's one of those people that like when you meet them, you're going to like them, and I'm sure you're going to like. If I read her whole resume, it would take up all your time. So I'll just let you come up here and speak, and we can talk about your resume over wide later. But she's got a great resume. We're pleased to have her with us, and so please welcome Tammy Nemeth.
Thank you, Danny, and the organizers for your hard work in pulling this all together and assembling such a great group of people. I'm humbled to be a part of this gathering and have really appreciated the excellent talks yesterday and earlier today. The theme of this conference is meeting the Return to Freedom challenge. This is indeed a challenge at this particular moment in history, because the world as we know it, and Canada in particular, is teetering on the edge of a shift or a great reset in how we live, how our society works, how our economy functions. Like a game of Jenga, our tower of values and principles that have held us up are being removed and replaced to the point where we are only 1 or 2 bricks away from the entire tower collapsing. The pending collapse of our Western civilization has been long in the making, in large part through a cultural shift. But once energy systems begin to fail, in this case deliberately, the rippling collapse across the entire global economy will accelerate like falling dominoes. And in fact, dominoes falling is the logo of the Cascade Institute, whose mission is to actually bring about this cascade collapse. This institute is run by Thomas Homer Dixon. Now, this paradigm shift, this great reset, is the embodiment of, or perhaps more accurately, the culmination of the inversion of Enlightenment values that have been occurring in our culture for at least the past 50 years. The Enlightenment, as some philosophers have said, was a cry for freedom. Central to freedom are reason, rationality, logic, and honesty. How can we have freedom in our country if we can't have honesty? How can we have freedom in our country if we deny reason, rationality, and logic? How do we know that the fruits of the Enlightenment, Western civilization, are being destroyed? By recognizing this inversion of these principles and values. And if our current system is being destroyed, what is being offered in its place? To explore these questions, I will first examine 3 areas where reason, rationality, logic, and honesty are in short supply: the COVID response, the climate change narrative, and net zero deceptions. Then I will discuss how these contribute to facilitating the new global paradigm. COVID response. Does everyone remember a mere 2 months ago the COVID theater of masking in restaurants? A mask had to be worn entering a restaurant, but you could take it off when you sat down and commenced eating and drinking. But the mask would have to be put back on to leave the table and the restaurant. Did that make any sense? As if an airborne virus could tell the difference between a person sitting, eating, or leaving. The restrictions seemed arbitrary and nonsensical. What was deemed an essential business and what not? Depending on which province you lived in, low-impact fitness sessions were permitted, but capped at 25 people, yet churches were closed. Churches weren't considered essential, but marijuana stores were. Small shops had to close, but big box stores could stay open. In the stores, people were commanded to walk in a certain direction. In some provinces, a large supermarket could sell food, but their non-food sections were sealed off. Why? Criticisms of restrictions were suppressed. Discussion of COVID treatments other than vaccination was essentially forbidden. People wrote their MLAs and MPs pointing out therapeutics and treatment protocols in other jurisdictions, and they received no reply. There was no honest conversation or discussion about therapeutics and treatments, only the exhortation to trust the experts, trust the science. Well, which experts, which science? Why forbid the prescribing of off-label medicines? Why wouldn't you try what you had available if people were willing? This was not rational or reasonable. There is still a complete suspension of rational thought and common sense. International health authorities such as the CDC and Mayo Clinic now both recognize that vaccination does not prevent getting or spreading the virus. Until the Trucker Freedom Convoy, provinces seemed determined to keep restrictions and vaccine passports indefinitely. Then, within weeks of the protest starting, the vaccine passport mandate was lifted by most provinces: Saskatchewan, Alberta, eventually Ontario, somewhat in Quebec and BC, and so on. Triple vaxxed and boosted politicians across the country, including the Prime Minister, who seemed to have contracted COVID from his vaccinated children, have gotten the virus and spread it to others. Yet the federal vaccine mandate remains, and the unvaccinated, as we've heard, are banned from taking a plane, train, or boat, apparently to stop the spread of the virus, while the vaccinated, who clearly can get it and spread it, are free to travel. Prime Minister Trudeau says he follows the experts. Well, why not in this case? Now, this list could go on. Perhaps what made all of these discrepancies, contradictions, and nonsense stand out was that it permeated everyone's daily life. We lived it. We experienced it. Most complied with it, whilst grumbling how it didn't make sense. The same extent of uneasiness with the dishonesty ought to apply to the issue of climate change and the so-called climate emergency, but sadly, it doesn't. Those questioning the climate change narrative have been effectively marginalized, I'm sad to say, such that one cannot express any skepticism without being called a denier, with all of the negative connotations associated with that term. Here are a few examples of the inversion of rationality, reason, logic, and honesty in the climate change narrative. As described convincingly before me by Michelle Stirling, climate models are given preference over real data. Don't trust your own measurements, believe in the models, we are told. But it isn't always scientists who communicate their findings. There's an intermediary, the media. News reports and articles essentially claim that the models are more representative than reality. If journalists are practicing advocacy journalism, then is it really journalism? Is it maybe perhaps propaganda? Here it's useful to make the distinction between editorializing and reporting. Quite often, news reporting is actually editorializing, and people are misled into thinking the story is honest. But when Covering Climate Now, for example, says it's the world's largest collaborative group for telling the climate story, and you look at their list of over 400 partners, including Bloomberg and Reuters, all major US networks, and even the Canadian Weather Network, then one has to question the truth and honesty of any story that mentions climate, particularly from a climate reporter, as Andrew mentioned earlier. Which brings us to the dishonest reporting on weather events. Every weather event nowadays is declared to be extreme weather caused by climate change. And the Climate Discussion Nexus had a great little comment about how we've been conditioned in Pavlov style to think of every weather event as climate change. These breathless proclamations are made through those studies and reports, even in the IPCC, show declines in weather events. For example, forest fires happen every year, so many of which are caused by arson. But in the past few years, activists have seized on this to say the earth is on fire. Every forest fire is claimed to be the result of man-made climate change. But empirical or real data, not models, show fewer fires than ever. Why persist in the false narrative? How many average people read beyond the headline or the news story? False claims and manipulated data extend to the historical record. Now, as a historian, I found it outrageous that so-called climate scientists would suggest there was no such thing as a medieval warming period or a little ice age, that the various historical and anthropological, let alone the geological record, either don't exist or they're wrong. Now, John Robson at the Climate Discussion Nexus has an excellent new backgrounder video on the denial of the medieval warming period and little ice age. Logic and reason and a real commitment to the scientific method would not cherry-pick data or dishonestly manipulate graphs to achieve a certain outcome. Yet here we are, stuck with simple slogans that seem to be designed to trick people. Now, the biggest lie, the biggest falsehood is that there is and has been some sort of stable temperature for Earth, but people are disrupting that stability. When in the history of the planet has there ever been a stable temperature? So why the lie? Which brings us to the net zero plans. Yesterday, we heard brilliantly from Francis Menton and Bob Lyman about the engineering and physical realities about renewable energy. There are significant material and physics-based limits to running an advanced technological economy on renewable energy. There are numerous engineering reports and studies outlining these limitations, and I've read many of them. Yet governments and policymakers, some of which commission these reports, then willingly ignore those studies. Rational thought and common sense are suspended. Why? Activists and their government supporters dishonestly tell Canadians that it's just a simple matter of swapping one form of energy for another, as if all they need to do is snap their fingers and hey presto, oil and gas are gone and wind and solar and batteries are there instead. They dishonestly lead the public to believe that it's just a matter of will and money to make it happen. We're just not trying hard enough. We're not doing our part. Similar arguments are made regarding vehicles. Canadians are told it's easy to just swap your gas or diesel car or truck to an electric vehicle. Tough luck if you can't afford it. Just call an Uber, take a bus, ride your bike, or better yet, walk. If you're going to be stubborn and want to keep your SUV or your truck, the government will likely tax or regulate you into compliance. Is it not an affront to freedom and a supposedly free market system for the government to mandate what vehicle you can buy and to ban that which is reliable? The conversation rarely gets around to where all the added electricity is going to come from to replace the energy from hydrocarbons. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the spike in gas prices from the consuming embargo and the carbon tax, Canadians are being told this switch can happen rapidly, with few, if any, negative consequences to the grid. In defiance of logic engineers, and others who say otherwise are ignored. Recent events in Europe have vibrantly demonstrated the geopolitical reality that switching Canada's energy systems to full-scale renewables will make Canada more vulnerable, not less vulnerable, to international events in hostile and aggressive countries such as China. Energy security ought to be at the top of the agenda. Instead, bizarrely, Canada and the EU, rather than recognize the weakness caused by 15 years of destabilizing reliable energy infrastructure, have committed to double down on the net zero transition. This makes no sense, especially in Canada, with the world's third largest reserves of oil. It defies reason. We are told that CO2 emissions must be controlled, yet the world's biggest CO2 emitters have a pass from the IPCC and Paris Agreement. China won't even consider stopping its emissions growth until 2030, let alone begin decreasing them. What sense does it make for Canada to destroy its economy by destroying its energy industry when it has a negligible contribution in overall emissions, a whopping 1.6%, something Bob Lyman also pointed out yesterday? Where is the honest conversation in the public square? Now, while this presentation has provided a few examples of dishonesty and inversion of core Enlightenment values related to freedom, there are many more across our culture that I don't have time to delve into, such as the woke movement, deplatforming or canceling people for their beliefs, forcing people to deny what they know to be true by controlling speech, the attacks on freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of movement, freedom of association, through legislation being proposed right now in Parliament and executed recently with the Emergencies Act, and so on. This inversion of freedom and Enlightenment values of reason, rationality, logic, and honesty illustrate clearly the paradigm shift that is happening to our society. Now, intended or not, the COVID pandemic has created an opportunity of disruption. Our habits, our social interactions, how we live, how we communicate, how we live out our daily lives, all have been interrupted. This disruption had to be sustained for as long as possible, to the brink of revolt, to try and lay down new ways of thinking, new ways of living, new habits, new ways of accepting expert and government direction over what we say, think, and do. People become more malleable when confronted with instability, more susceptible to offers of stability, more amenable to accepting changes if it means a return to predictability and some sense of certainty. All of these elements are interconnected to the undermining of our current system. Rationality is replaced with absurdity. Evidence is replaced with subjectivity and emotion. Consistency is replaced by contradictions. But the hardest thing to grasp, as Bruce Pardy and I discussed recently on my podcast, it's not supposed to make sense. That's the point. Logic and reason no longer underlay government decision-making or their credentialed cheerleaders. Fellow historian Neil Oliver at GB News pointed out something very significant recently: the unresponsiveness of supposedly democratic political leaders to citizen concerns. The political leaders know that we know the COVID response, the climate emergency, the suicidal net zero policies, the new normal are irrational, illogical, and dishonest. But they don't care. They don't care that we know. Why is that? In fact, the new normal, the silver lining of the pandemic, was presented as an opportunity to build back better, build back greener. Did anyone wonder why all the Western countries seemed to sing from the same song sheet when COVID hit? Build Back Better was the placard on display at every press conference. Very similar pandemic responses were implemented in almost every Western country, all seemingly in lockstep, where countries may be coordinating through the G7, or maybe the OECD or the UN. It doesn't appear so. In fact, it seems that the World Economic Forum was acting as the convener and the coordinator of the Global Action Group on the post-COVID-19 world. Rebel News obtained through a Freedom of Information request a briefing note prepared for Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland from the World Economic Forum for her role as co-chair of the World Economic Forum Global Coordinating Group. By the way, the briefing note dated December 2020 indicates that this was the fourth meeting of this group. And this was after the Prime Minister dishonestly declared that the Great Reset and the World Economic Forum's coordinating aspects was a conspiracy theory. It would seem then that the similarity in COVID responses and the various accelerations of the net zero plans were indeed coordinated to some extent with a view to transforming our post-COVID world, which begs the question, what is being offered to replace our current system? Is the Great Reset a part of it? I believe so, yes. There's momentum for a shift, and the World Economic Forum, which helped generate that momentum, is taking advantage of it. As I've argued elsewhere, there's a transnational global movement to facilitate a great transformation or great reset to a new global economy that intends to halt fossil fuel development in order to create a new global green, decarbonized, net zero civilization based on a technocratic, beyond GDP, degrowth, nature and well-being based circular economy. This new world order, in the works for over 50 years, will have a new financial system, a new Bretton Woods, perhaps a new form of governance and a new type of economy. Its core principles will be the antithesis of the Enlightenment values that have informed, shaped, and guided the best of Western civilizations for centuries. Climate change, the pandemic, and now the war between Russia and Ukraine are being used as the rationale for revolution. Now, the Great Reset, introduced in June 2020, is one system or plan being proposed, but it has an organization behind it, with its tendrils in governments, corporations, universities, think tanks, NGOs, media, multilateral institutions that could very well see this new system being adopted. The transformation outlined by the Great Reset is the antithesis of freedom and enlightenment principles. Markets will be directed by governments with the help of their corporate facilitators. Wealth taxes will facilitate equality of outcome. Carbon taxes and offset purchases will redistribute wealth to developing countries. Recovery packages will be green. Investments will be directed for equality and sustainability. International financial systems will be recalibrated, and the digital transformation of society, in line with the fourth industrial revolution, will be accelerated. Included in this reset is a commitment to the net zero energy transition, ESG metrics, and of course, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So what evidence is there of this new global paradigm being more than just talk and proposals? Well, for several years, the idea has been floated of the need for a new global financial system. The IMF head, Kristalina Georgieva, has spoken on this many times over the past several years. Now, the sanctions against Russia has actually accelerated this movement. At the recent World Government Summit in Dubai, at the panel on the New World Order, introduced by Klaus Schwab, there was agreement that the world was at an inflection point. The global community was being bifurcated, and nations would have to take sides. Russia, China, and the other BRIC countries and those dependent on them on one side using one currency, and the West, Europe, US, Canada, Australia, and their supporters on the other side. They were talking that the dominance of the US dollar would, of course, be severely diminished in this split. Sanctions will bring about food shortages, but it's all for the greater good in punishing Russian aggression. When chaos hits and it looks hopeless, we'll look for stability. And as Schwab stated at the summit, and I quote, "In times of crisis, the role of government is more important and more relevant than ever," end quote. He said something similar when announcing the Great Reset in June 2020. This is another opportunity to grow power and subservience to the handouts, even if it means curtailing freedom and independence. Now, many at the summit felt that a global digital currency and its partner, a digital ID, would be the best outcome after the initial chaos. 91 countries, including Canada, the US, and the Eurozone, are developing central bank digital currencies. The EU, Canada, including the provinces of Ontario and Alberta, are also working on a digital ID. Saskatchewan was as well until about 3 weeks ago when people heard about it, and now Saskatchewan says they'll wait and see how it goes in Alberta and Ontario. Privacy and freedom will be obliterated because, as one panelist at the summit remarked, and I quote, "We're about to abandon the traditional system of money and accounting into a new one, digital. It means having an almost perfect record of every single transaction that happens in the economy, which will give us far greater clarity over what is going on." Clarity. This aligns with what Mark Carney's been saying. What gets measured gets managed. Well, we'll all be managed because we'll all be measured. This is 21st century fascism and oligarchy of the progressive elite. Another warned that it will shift the balance of power between citizens and government, and therefore a constitution of digital rights might be necessary. This doesn't inspire much confidence since we can't even follow our existing constitutions. ESG metrics and climate-related financial disclosures, which I don't have time to get into, are integral to all of this, as they offer another element of centralized control and monitoring, reducing the freedom of companies and investors, but with the intent to trickle it down to the monitoring of every individual through a digital ID, digital currency, personal ESG scores, or carbon trading, like the MasterCard CO2 carbon footprint credit card mentioned by Mark Morano yesterday. This could then be wrapped into a social credit style system. Think of how easy it would be for governments to weaponize this information and the profiles they would create on each and every one of us. Say the wrong thing, think the wrong thing, donate money to the wrong cause, and now your bank account is frozen, your driver's license suspended, your mortgages and loans canceled. How will these changes be represented to the public? In January of this year, Klaus Schwab published The Great Reset Volume 2, The Great Narrative. Many global thinkers were invited to Dubai in November 2021 to discuss how best to structure and communicate to the masses the brave new world they were designing and creating. A key element of that narrative is to have citizens of the West, particularly the youth, lower their expectations of prosperity to meet global climate targets and restructure the global system. Now, will this communication be an honest conversation? Deutsche Bank researcher Eric Heyman wrote a report about the need for an honest conversation about the net zero transition. Is it possible for our government leaders to speak honestly? Heyman said, and I quote, "A certain degree of eco-dictatorship will be necessary because if we really want to achieve climate neutrality, we need to change our behavior in all these areas of life." He then suggested that the eco-dictatorship would come in the form of tightening regulatory law considerably. This could mean forcing people not to travel, changing the means of transport, mandating the size of one's home, how we heat our homes, how many electronic devices we have, how often they are used, how much meat and exotic fruit we eat, and so on. The world in which we now live is being shaped and guided by a governing class and an intellectual elite that has been dishonest to the general public about this transition. Certainly, the academics, the researchers, and the activists have been quite open and clear within their narrow circles about what changes Western societies need to make to fulfill this transformation. But these ideas have not really been articulated to the general public. However, released a few weeks ago, for the first time, an IPCC report has an entire chapter outlining the lifestyle, behavior, and standard of living requirements for the ideal climate emergency society. It even outlines acceptable, or what they call sufficient living standards, and the necessary lifestyle changes leaders in the West will have to nudge or impose on their unwilling citizens. Our current spike in inflation, the increase in interest rates, the supply chain problems, the agricultural troubles could force people into these behavioral changes simply because they won't be able to afford to heat their homes or keep their home or have a car or eat meat. A recent tweet by a Bloomberg op-ed person says it all. Take the bus, don't buy bulk, eat lentils instead of meat. Nobody said this would be fun. The president of BlackRock hinted that something big is coming. He called us an entitled generation, and I quote, "For the first time, this generation is going to go into a store and not be able to get what they want. I would put on your seatbelts because this is something we haven't seen." That's Rob Capito, BlackRock president. How fortuitous and convenient for those pushing for net zero and the energy transition. With the approach taken to COVID, the climate change narrative, and the current net zero trajectory, the Trudeau government has demonstrated that it's a willing participant in the Great Reset. To an honest observer, the Canadian government seems to have abandoned logic, rationality, common sense, and honesty in service of facilitating the new global paradigm. The consequences are a destabilization of the Canadian economy and an accelerating erosion of Canadians' prosperity and freedom. This change in our current prosperous way of living, taking place not just in Canada, but in almost all Western countries, could not be brought about without dishonesty, without giving up logic, rationality, and common sense. If dishonest means are necessary to create this change, then what does that say about the ultimate solution, whatever shape it may take in the end? Now, at the beginning, I posed the questions: how can we have freedom in our country if we can't have honesty? How can we have freedom in our country if we deny reason, rationality, and logic? The answer is we can't. As long as we allow the lies, the irrational and illogical policies and laws to go unchallenged, then we will not be free. Therefore, we must continue to challenge the falsehoods, the illogic, the irrational policies, the statements, rules, and regulations whenever, wherever, and with whomever we can, with relatives, with friends, with our elected representatives, with business leaders. Shifting how people think about these issues will make a difference, but we must have hope and perseverance because it won't be easy, and we must be pockets of resistance. I would like to conclude with an observation from former Pope Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger, who wrote in his essay, Truth and Freedom, and I quote, "Freedom without truth is no freedom at all." He explained that partial truths and half-truths are correlative to a lie. Deception and deceit enslaves a person. A person becomes a slave to the lie. Therefore, to be free, to have freedom, to exercise freedom, one must be honest, not only to oneself, but to the world in which we live. If we're honest, we see that these changes and the new world order are not benign, nor are they altruistic. They serve to undermine and destroy our freedom, our modern way of life, and the hydrocarbons at its heart. It's not just rule changes to how we do business, it's a complete system change. It's a new global paradigm. Our current system may not be perfect, but it has improved the care of our environment and planet and people unlike any others. This is a system worth restoring and fighting for. Thank you.
Stay here, we'll take a couple of questions. I think, yes, thank you very much. That's a well-deserved ovation. Thank you, Tammy. We've got, I'd like to stop for lunch at 11:25. So we've got 10 minutes. We've got time for a few questions. Does anybody want to ask a question or is... Okay. 30-second question, 30-second comment. What are we on here? Like... Come on, let's go. 30.
Got the stopwatch going.
Go.
Okay. General circulation models do not have any input for carbon dioxide. Therefore, they cannot predict warming from carbon dioxide because they've never put carbon dioxide into the models. So when all of the models are wrong, it's because they never put the carbon dioxide in to get the carbon dioxide warming out. That's what I do.
Good. You're getting better. We'll let you up here more often. That's right. Does anybody want to answer that comment? No, I think it goes without saying. Dennis, did I see Dennis walking up here to ask a question, or where did Dennis Modry go? Or I thought he was coming up to ask a question. Are you coming to ask a question, Steve? Sure. Okay. Well, just while he's coming up here, so we're going to stop for lunch at 11:30 because Premier Peckford wants to speak at 12. So we'll. But anyway, we'll take Steve's question and then we'll go from there.
Just a question is for Michelle and Tammy as well. Has anybody taken into consideration the evaluation of what Physics Girl says? If you look on YouTube, she's about the Carrington event and another Carrington event. We're overdue. And if that happens, all the EVs and all the other digital, and I guess I'm just wondering the consequences of that kind of a thing, which is definitely going to happen. Just when it's going to happen, I don't know. We're saying they're overdue every 150 years or 200 years. Anyway, what's your thoughts on that?
Tell them what the Carrington event is if you happen to know.
I will. The Carrington event was a massive coronal mass ejection from the sun. This is like when a solar flare blasts out from the sun. And these happen all the time, but this was a particularly big one. I think, did you say X45? No, it was Ron. 45? X factor 45. The Carrington event was so powerful. It's charged, it charges the atmosphere with electrons, and it actually was lighting on fire some of the telegraph wires. This happened in 1859. Thank you. Yeah. So, and there was another one more recently that hit Earth in 1989 in Quebec, and it fried the transformers. Really big electricity transformers. The plates inside are fried like they're tinfoil. And those things cannot be replaced off the shelf. They need years to order. So there were 6 million people in the dark for several weeks in the Quebec incident. I'm sure that it is going to happen. We have put it in many of our reports about net zero and about decarbonization and electrification that if one of these if one hit today, we'd be in big trouble because society is so reliant on electricity. But we still have, simple pumps get gas out of tanks underground, which could be repaired quite easily. But if we were in a completely EV and electrified world, we'd all die. That would, we'd die in very short order, and it wouldn't take long. You just have to look at Blair King's blog, a chemist in Langley, and he's done a little description about what would happen if fossil fuels vanished today. It would be a zombie apocalypse within a couple of weeks, and he means it. And that would be in the BC Lower Mainland where it's temperate. If it happened here in winter, very few people would survive. Anyway.
You want to comment on that, Tammy? No. No, I'm already depressed enough. I don't want to say anymore. And Anthony Fury actually wrote a good book on that. It was called Pulse Attack. And if you're looking for one more thing to worry about, you should get his book and read that. But if you want some hope, you could buy Michael Wagner's book, and we'll have our own country, and we'll have fossil fuels, and it won't matter quite so much. But in any event, go ahead, come and ask us another question.
I have so many questions, but I'll keep it to one. Tammy, how do you think it was possible to get all of these associations on board? Even down to my accounting association with this idiocy on the ESG and whatnot. And I just don't understand how that's possible.
Thank you for that question. It's very good. It's been built up over a long period of time, and there was an attempt made in 2008 after the first financial crisis to try and do something like what they're doing now. There was lots of talk about green recovery and all that kind of thing, but it didn't work the way they expected. And Thomas Homer Dixon made the argument that we need a cultural shift to make the paradigm shift. And so there was a lot of work done, not just in education and in universities and so on. There was also a lot of work done in the financial industry because they also realized once the fracking revolution happened that there were ways out of it, what they were planning. If you could frack, because one of the things was that the United States was going to run out of oil and gas. This was the whole peak oil movement and whatnot. And once fracking happened, there was this devastation amongst people that, oh my gosh, how could we let this happen? How do we stop the investment? And this is where Mark Carney comes in, because he's been going around talking to people, and he was very clear at the NGFS meetings where they were pushing the TCFD recommendations and the changes to climate-related financial disclosures and whatnot, that you have to talk about it to the banks, you have to talk about it to the insurers, you have to talk about it to the investors, and you have to persuade them that this is the way it's going to be. And you're relentless in messaging. Mark Carney has been relentless. He talks wherever he has an opportunity. And so it then builds up this momentum, which is why I talk about Klaus Schwab helping trigger that momentum. And once the momentum is going, like Michael talked about yesterday, there's lots of different hangers on. There's the opportunists who just think, well, I'm going to game this system. There's other people who are looking to see which way it's going to roll. If it looks like this is going to be the dominant way, they want to jump in on the bandwagon, be an early mover. And this is what Carney's been talking about a lot, is that you want to be in early to do this stuff, because if you wait too long, there's going to be stranded assets and it's going to be terrible for you. So now it's trickling down into all the investment firms, into the insurance companies. And I don't know exactly how it can stop at this point, but this is the trajectory. Whether the ultimate plan, it takes the shape of what he says in the Great Reset, I don't know, but this is the trajectory we're on. And it's not a theory. They're out there talking about it. They're holding summits about it. We've got these action groups going on, being convened and coordinated. And we have to be realistic that this is the trajectory and we need to do something to try and stop it.
You want to comment on that? Yeah.
Yes, and people should know that all pension plans are on board with this. In the 1970s, Peter Drucker wrote a book about how union pensions would become the biggest investors in corporate America. I think it's called the Unseen Revolution. And groups like CUPE have a big climate change contingent within their organization. And CUPE voted against the Trans Mountain Pipeline. CUPE-PC did. CUPE wrote a petition to Barack Obama to block Keystone XL. This is the Canadian Union of Public Employees. How do you think they're going to get paid? But that's how deeply embedded it is. And they have, like I said, trillions of dollars. So their influence is huge, just as NEI Investments, which is a combination of Desjardins and the Credit Union System of Canada. They had huge influence on the Alberta government and the climate change plan under Rachel Notley. In fact, they delivered a letter that basically said, this is what we think you should do. And that's basically what she did. And the letter started saying, we represent 120 signatories on this letter who have $7 trillion in investments assets under management, something to that effect. So that's where all this influence is coming from. It's the money sector. And they're using the ENGOs to front the movement.
But again, one of the, sometimes it almost seems like an impossible challenge, but we're all consumers. And I mean, I think one of the things that we all need to be a little more discerning about is actually where we're spending our money. Like we're consumers with cash. And if we all give some thought to like what we support and what we don't, and the list of, I had some very dear friends in the federal conservative movement, but I don't get as many Christmas cards as I used to since I started speaking out against the Paris Agreement. But quite frankly, like I've been saying, and I think most of the folks here agree, I've been saying, get Canada out of the Paris Agreement or get Alberta out of Canada. Like it's a simple choice for those of us in Alberta. Some of you that don't live it, but again, and like John Carpy mentioned this yesterday, like there's some like all this like lobbying the insurance company and everything else, that all takes time. It takes years. I mentioned yesterday the Regina Manifesto, but we're having an election in a year. And I can tell you, start telling some of these people, I'm not voting for anybody that's not planning on getting us out of the Paris Agreement. That will get their attention. There's nothing, where they say there's nothing like a public hanging to get your attention, particularly if you're the one who's going to get hung. And to me, but I think we need to be quite forceful, bordering on being rude with some of our elected people. Here we are, we're all people of, working people. Somehow we figure out the problem we've got, but we all have friends who are elected politicians making, hundreds of thousands of dollars. They have research assistants, they have one thing and another. And most of them, you talk to them about therapeutics or the Paris Agreement or some of this stuff, and they look at you and their eyes glaze over and they say, well, what the heck is going on here? So, I think we need to start holding them a little more accountable. And this just reminded me of when Norm came up here. I just thought, I'm like Norm, I'm sort of like a dog with a bone on some of these issues. But, the 200 and some academics that wrote from our universities that wrote the letter to, get out of the Paris Agreement. Well, I think we should write them all a letter back and say, fine. Some of them are quite a few of them are from universities in Alberta. And we should say, we're working on that, and we're gonna your funding next year is going to be indexed to the people who support the oil industry. Your funding will come from revenues from the oil industry, and those of you who support windmills and turbines and solar panels, your funding will come from the taxes from the solar panels. You can be sure there'd be a lot less believers in it, when they got their first check, which would be net zero, but nevertheless. Norm?
Very important comment.
Okay. Okay. 20 seconds.
No, it's 10 seconds.
Good.
The Paris Climate Agreement is what gives Ottawa control over Alberta. So we don't have our control unless we get out of the Paris Agreement. And that's it. It's just, once it was ratified, it gives the federal government legal jurisdiction over our resource industries on the basis of emissions. And it's all BS, to be polite. So that's Paris Agreement is number one for Alberta. Whether we stay or go, it depends on the Paris Agreement.
Yes, exactly. Go ahead, come on.
This is a little bit more of an observation. The last two speakers have been fantastic. I think one reason why maybe a lot of people aren't jumping up and asking questions is because it's a lot of information, and you can see it's coming from so many different areas, which means, just like anything else, follow the money. What makes it so difficult to try to resolve this or solve it or have the pendulum start turning going the other direction, is because there's so many different groups that are involved. But, and this is where I kind of see, after hearing the two talks, this is where I see a light at the end of the tunnel. One, take a look at Russia versus Ukraine. What did all the experts say the first week? Ukraine's going to be gone within 2-3 days. And look what's happening now. Look at individual little battles is what it's going to take. Sometimes what we look at is we look at the big picture and we're like, we're just swamped. We just cannot resolve this at all. Where do we begin? Where we begin is each and every one of those little points that she kind of showed. We need to start and attack each and every one of them. Not all at once, but each one of them at the right. I mean, look at something like Elon Musk. What Elon Musk is trying to do to Twitter. He's messing up the left wing and everything. And of course, all the left wing's bombarding him. We're going to need more people like Elon Musk. So that, the one example was look what the Ukraine has done for Russia, against Russia, and putting defenses up. And number two, and this is only because I come from the States, and 98% of my life has been in the States, and only 2% has been in Canada. But I look at the abortion side in America since early 1970s. That's when abortion, Roe v. Versus Wade, basically really took effect and all. And look at how far they've come, where it looked like it was going to be no chance of ever getting things changed. But after getting information out, after trying different directions, after going after little pinpoints. Oh, hi.
Yeah, I've got 20 seconds.
I got 20 seconds. I was just I got to talk real quick. You can see even after what looked like it was me, no hope at all, there's hope and a lot of change can happen. And the same thing with the Greenpeace, with the climate change, there is hope, but we have to tackle it at individual spots and just keep going and never give up hope. Just wanted to mention that.
That's good. Thank you. That was a good comment. And we're actually going to continue the question and answer after lunch, but just so we can be on time with Premier Peckford, we're going to stop right now. Thank you very much, ladies. Let's give them a hand. Thank you very much. And then I was reminded yesterday that we forgot to ask the blessing on the food. So if you'll just bear with me for like 30 seconds, we'll ask our friend Bob Smith to ask the blessing on our lunch, and then we'll have lunch, and then we're actually going to play a little video that John found that he thought was quite entertaining and informative. So it'll just be playing. I think you're going to put the video on that while we're eating our lunch. But anyway, let's ask Bob to ask the blessing.
I just wanted to say thank you to God, to Danny, for bringing together these presenters who've given us so much truth and knowledge and inspiration. And I just want to include that in our prayers. Oh God, our Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for all of the things that we've just talked about. Our nation is in a time of great transition.